There is no hero's welcome for Peter Housty. Just a lonely walk to the ferry in an oversized jacket someone gave him.
Good morning.
Morning.
There you go. Have a good day.
You too.
Housty is taking us back to the battleground off the coast of Vancouver Island, the residential school where he says he was physically and sexually attacked for 9 years.
Feels like I'm going to scream and yell and cry my guts out. After coming out of treatment, I haven't gone back there. This is the first time since the treatment since I went back to Alert Bay.
It's a terror shared by thousands of former students who received an apology from then Prime Minister Stephen Harper in 2008.
The Government of Canada built an educational system in which very young children were often forcibly removed from their homes, often taken far from their communities. Many were inadequately fed, clothed, and housed. All were deprived of the care and nurturing of their parents, grandparents, and communities. Today we recognize that this policy of assimilation was wrong, has caused great harm, and has no place in our country.
I think how I was able to get it was work for long hours of the time, and that didn't work. So I ended off becoming an alcoholic and reached my potential in drinking. And painfully, I didn't think that I should become an alcoholic, and I did.
Order, à l'ordre. J'invite les honorables.
The residential school apology was supposed to kick off a new era of reconciliation in Canada. And signal a better relationship with its Indigenous peoples, like Housty. Housty was one of over 9,200 children seized from remote villages and shipped here to St. Michael's.
I was excited for the first week. Got to know the people that were looking after the school. They were basically beating the crap out of other kids. We were hit with real long straps. They were like so, and they put salt and pepper on both of your hands, and you have no flesh on your hands, no skin. All you have is flesh. No, that's all you were able to see was just the skin or the meat on your hands. And it was bleeding.
The students called it St. Mike's. It was one of about 150 schools used to educate Indigenous children across the country in what Canada later admitted was an aggressive assimilation program.
It was more of beatings and a lot of sexual abuse there, and it was an ongoing thing. It was like a 24-hour thing, 7 days a week, 24/7. And if you didn't do what they told you to do, they put you in a hospital or.
Churches ran the schools on the government's behalf. About 150,000 children went through the system for over 100 years. That's why the apology was so important. It legitimized survivors' experiences and officially acknowledged the trauma that occurred there.
I see so many images of things that actually went on there. Like, say, for example, people that actually got buried on that island. And I'm talking about kids that actually got buried on that island. It's shallow graves. People that actually killed themselves because of the beatings, the sexual abuse.
The apology was part of the Indian Residential Schools Settlement Agreement, the biggest out-of-court settlement in Canada's history. It was negotiated by a team from the Assembly of First Nations, led by Phil Fontaine, a residential school survivor and former national chief.
For our parents, our grandparents, great-grandparents, indeed, for all of the generations which have preceded us, this day testifies to nothing less than the achievement of the impossible. For the generations that will follow us, we bear witness today in this House that our survival as First Nations peoples in this land is affirmed forever.
Working on that negotiating team was Dene Chief Bill Erasmus. He says the apology very nearly didn't happen.
We know that the Prime Minister did not want to apologize in Parliament. He wanted to apologize in a different setting. He wanted to do it in just in a meeting hall. And we said no. Our elders insisted that it be in Parliament. We pushed back, and people like Phil Fontaine, the National Chief of the Assembly of First Nations, did not know until 20 minutes before it actually happened that he was able to speak in front of Parliament. But he had his speech ready, and he was prepared to do it.
Coming up, Erasmus and others will share how the government continued to assert its dominance in a process meant to highlight the evils of colonization.
Because we had to fight our way through the whole process, from the court action to getting rid of the denial of the churches and the federal government to actually making it work, it allowed the federal government to still be in charge of the process.
And why the goal of reconciliation for the nation and survivors like Housty became such a battle. Nature has done its best to cover the scar.
We didn't know what was going on at that time. And it all had to do with selling kids and they would get abused by these older guys.
The school was where Housty now stands.
They would have kids lined up in the basement, telling the kids to stand still, and these older guys would pick these kids. And It was like a smorgasbord to these old guys.
The horrors of Canada's residential schools were covered up for more than a century. No one wanted to take responsibility or be on the hook financially.
People were denied for years and years that this actually happened. And it really messed up a lot of our former students because they knew that things happened in those mission schools, those hostels, those residences.
Housty's parents and grandparents were also sent to St. Mike's, but they couldn't talk about it.
I learned how to become a drunk before going into residential school.
Why is that?
My parents were, they went through residential school, so did my grandparents, went to residential school.
But why were they drinking?
Because they went through residential school and saw the same thing happen to them when they went to school, and abuse, sexual abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse.
After the apology, it was like the dam broke.
Well, some former students have spoken positively about their experiences at residential schools. These stories are far overshadowed by tragic accounts of the emotional, physical, and sexual abuse and neglect of helpless children.
It was suddenly okay to say you were a residential school survivor, and that's why you and your community were so damaged.
And that was when Canada and the churches finally agreed that this is real and that there were wrongs done and that they were prepared to settle. And many people say that they probably wouldn't have provided the compensation if they weren't compelled to.
The government and the churches agreed to pay $4 billion. This would fund the 5 terms of the settlement agreement: the apology, compensation for survivors, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, various commemoration projects, and health and wellness initiatives. Compensation was split into 2 parts. First was a Common Experience Payment, or CEP, for all students, $10,000 for the first year, and $3,000 for each year of school after that. Housty received $34,000. Then he applied for the second part, the Independent Assessment Process, or IAP. Compensation for serious physical and sexual abuse.
I saw a psychologist. She turned around and said that I was that I had memories of sexual abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse, and that it affected my life.
He was told to hire a lawyer to prepare for his hearing, where he would tell an adjudicator what he had been covering up for most of his life.
They said I had a claim, and after the hearing, the adjudicator came to my face and said I was Category 5.
Survivors' damages were valued between 1 and 5 using this scale that came to be known as the meat chart. 1 was the lowest. They were tough hearings, but that's not why this Saskatoon lawyer stopped being an adjudicator.
I was witnessing poor representation of the claimants. Oftentimes, lawyers were showing up having only met their clients that morning. I thought that if I could represent claimants and treat them with the respect that they deserve, that the outcomes could be much better for them.
It was a problem that would rock the IAP. About a dozen lawyers were under suspicion.
So you had somebody who say was sexually assaulted. They had their application filled out by a form filler who was being paid X amount of dollars to get an application. And they just, and then the form filler would turn that over to the law office, and then the law office would send a lawyer the day of the hearing.
The worst offender was Blott and Company of Calgary. This man, lawyer David Blott, signed up more than 5,000 IAP clients in every province and territory. He was then found guilty of exploiting them financially and kicked out of the IAP.
There can be no doubt that IAP claimants were, in the system established by Blott, treated not as individual people who had, in many cases, suffered traumatic personal experiences at a very young age, but rather as claims requiring little lawyer interaction.
Social worker Joanne Hansen helped expose the mistreatment.
From the client's perspective, it's just like being re-victimized. They were told we could trust the legal system because the government said that.
But Blott was allowed to keep the money he earned from the IAP, an estimated $21 million.
The real crime here is the lack of respect that you must have for your claimants to take the money. And so when we talk about reconciliation, how does that reconcile anything?
Blott was close to being disbarred when the Law Society of Alberta let him resign instead.
This is the legal system that clearly can create loopholes to protect themselves and not the people.
Survivors filed a class action lawsuit against him to get some of their money back. We'll have more on that later. Meanwhile, Housty says he waited 2 years before his lawyer told him his IAP check was in the mail.
And I said I check my mail every single day. And they said, oh, we forgot to mail it. Then I overheard a conversation to this other person, said that it wasn't because they didn't want to do it, it was because they said that they didn't care to do my claim.
Lawyers were paid 15% from the government for each claim and could ask for up to another 15% from the survivor.
No, I never took the extra 15%. No.
Racine says on average a claim took 2.5 days or less to complete.
There was a time in the process where the claims were averaging close to $100,000, meaning you'd get $15,000 from the federal government for 2.5 days' work. And I think it was more than adequate.
Survivors were encouraged to complain to law societies who police lawyers in Canada. We asked each law society how many lawyers it investigated, disciplined, or disbarred for mishandling IAP cases. The Law Society of Manitoba said it disbarred a lawyer for stealing from residential school clients and disciplined 2 others for minor infractions. The Law Society of Alberta said it had no cases, even though that's where Blott resigned.
It has been difficult work. It has been difficult emotionally.
I was looking at the window, very homesick.
In the school, in the hospital, got beaten up for every wrong we did.
The Truth and Reconciliation Commission took the focus off the IAP lawyer scandal and put survivors back in the spotlight.
Many survivor stories remain difficult to hear.
Everybody's going on a healing journey.
I'm hurt for the rest of my life.
They didn't understand.
But we cannot permit discomfort to prevent us from accepting the truth.
The common experience payments, as in that process, is pretty much run its course. The IAP part of it is ongoing, and we know that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission its work is not done yet, so there's
How you doing,
still
my friend?
very well, thank you.
So Phil Fontaine was feeling confident that reconciliation was back on track.
I mean, even though it's had its challenges, I think it's been a fair process.
Understandably, survivors wanted some schools torn down, like St. Mike's. It seemed momentum was building. But what about those left behind? Like Peter Housty.
For them to actually okay the claim and never got nothing from it. Wow. That got me more angry, and I did more drinking and alcohol and drugs.
And some survivors in northwestern Ontario.
I had a survivor come to me, and he's in his 70s now. And he said, Garnet, I finally have enough strength to go for the compensation package. And I said, you know, sorry, but you missed the deadline for the IAP. It's over. And so he said to me, you mean I missed the boat? He said, yeah, you did, sadly and unfortunately, yeah, you did. And then and he said, you know, he looked at me really seriously and he said, you know how difficult it was to open up old wounds, tell my story for nothing.
Garnet Anjikaneb was concerned. The survivor and advocate in Sioux Lookout knew something had to be done.
One gentleman that showed me his letter from the adjudicator's office, and he said, your process, your application has been denied, and you have 30 days in which to appeal.
Anjikaneb intervened.
The response I got from the Secretary's office, are you a lawyer? I said, no, but I am an advocate for this man. And I was told, you can't talk on behalf of him because you're not a lawyer.
Frustrated so many survivors were falling through the cracks, Anjikaneb wrote this call to review the settlement agreement and sent it to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau.
While there have been many successes to celebrate in the implementation of the agreement, it is imperative that survivors feel that it has truly been a fair and just resolution that facilitates the journey of healing and reconciliation for them and for non-Aboriginal Canadians. Otherwise, there can be no consequential or meaningful reconciliation.
He was surprised and a little saddened when the government rejected his request.
I got a letter from an assistant from Carolyn Bennett's office. It said, thank you for your letter. We do from time to time review aspects of the agreement, and there's no need for overall comprehensive review of the settlement agreement. And thank you for writing. So I just left it at that.
Survivors had 5 years to file an IAP claim before the deadline expired in 2012. Figures supplied by the adjudicator's office show 38,098 survivors applied, 27,324 received compensation, and 7,717 claims were rejected for various reasons.
the records to start off with, and we never knew about records.
Mason led a grassroots organization in Manitoba that wanted survivors compensated simply for being survivors. He didn't think it was fair to make them testify in court or prove their story in any way.
I always said that we should never have to prove that we're put in those institutions. But yet they turn around and they ask us, oh, what did the guy look like? What did the perpetrator look like? Or, do you remember the color of the building?
I think they estimated the cohort at 80,000 at the time the settlement was implemented, and they thought there might be 15,000 IAP claimants. And by the time the deadline came along, the number was up to 30, I think it was in excess of 34,000.
Ian Pitfield is a retired judge in Vancouver. He says 34,000 is a lot of victims to compensate in the murky area of physical and sexual abuse.
It's very difficult to measure the credibility or the lack of credibility associated. And that doesn't mean that one's lying. It's just a question of, is it sufficient to be able to say that, yeah, it's more likely than not that abuse occurred. And if it is, you get an award, and if it isn't, you don't.
Pitfield supervised the hepatitis C class action settlement during the 1990s. We asked him to compare the two.
In the Hep C case, once medical records were produced, there was a review process, and the question there was whether or not the Hep C infection had been contracted through blood transfusion or otherwise. And one could assess that without the need for an adjudication review, but even then, those whose claims were rejected had an opportunity to appeal to the court. Here, things pretty well started and ended with the adjudication secretary.
Pitfield became familiar with the residential school settlement agreement when he was asked to take over the blot files and distribute them to new lawyers.
I was probably one of many first people that was chosen out of the blue to be his client.
Blot represented most of the survivors living on the Blood tribe in southern Alberta. They initiated a class action lawsuit to recoup the extra fees the court said Blot took. A few months ago, Blot offered $2 million to settle the suit, or about $500 per person. Tyrone Weaselhead called the offer a joke.
David Blot got away with millions and millions of dollars that we're not going to recover from it. He doesn't have to ever work again in the rest of his life, and he'll live comfortable with what he'd taken from the victims.
He's angry with the IAP too.
There's elders that have suffered 70 years ago through this residential school, 70 years ago. And these elders, there's an elder that got $600 compensation. $600 for 70 years. Is that justice? That's not justice to me. And that's what happened to a majority of the elders.
One of those elders was Weaselhead's late mother, Annie Plume. She relied on Blot to do her compensation claim, but it was rejected, even though she went deaf in one ear. A nun repeatedly struck. Weaselhead says his mother forgave Blot and the system that let her down before she died.
Sometimes I wish I could follow her footsteps and to forgive. But for me personally, I cannot forgive.
I'd be glad to share my culture with you. This is called a moss bag, made with beadwork and leather. Just nice smelling.
In this tiny corner of northwestern Saskatchewan live the survivors of Illilla Cross Residential School.
So we would have to go all the way here, look, all the way here. And the rapids right here, eh? You had to go through the rapids and all the way back behind there and up that way to get to Illilla Cross.
Mary Obishan is one of them. She's the go-to person in this Métis community of Pachinak, just down the road from English River First Nation. And that's part of the problem. Children from the two Indigenous communities were sent to different residential schools, but only one group of survivors has claimed compensation, the one from the First Nations school.
And because of that, I felt really discriminated against.
Well,
and
that's what that is, discrimination.
Yes.
Most of the good food was fed to the priests.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah.
I walked in one time, they were to eat, man, turkey, big pile of turkey, apples, oranges, everything, grapes. I never did taste them grapes.
I know their meals were really like royalty.
Yeah.
Survivors like Obashan say they suffered the same trauma and deserve the same access to compensation.
To me, all across was the same as Beauval. We left home and we're in a brick home. These guys were housed the same way or treated the same way or even worse in some cases.
Obashan remembers one nun in particular.
She would go and pinch you, twist your neck and your skin, like that's the torture she inflicted.
But this list shows it's not a question of heritage, but of who was running the schools. And Île-à-la-Crosse was under provincial jurisdiction, not the federal government's. Critics say this kind of administrative hair-splitting is hurting survivors and puts government interests ahead of healing.
I cannot accept that that has happened to so many people whose only crime was that they were Indian children.
Charlie Angus is the Member of Parliament for Timmins James Bay in northeastern Ontario. He is the one who confirmed Canada withheld evidence that would help thousands of survivors from St. Anne's Residential School in his riding obtain compensation.
I wrote to Minister Valcourt and said, under the Indian Residential Settlement Agreement, Canada is both the defendant and responsible for supplying evidence. So you knew there was evidence. Why didn't you go get it? And I was absolutely shocked when I got the response, which the government said, yeah, of course we knew about the evidence, but we were under no obligation to get it.
The Harper government was in power at the time. Bernard Valcourt was Minister of Aboriginal Affairs.
They had the evidence, they were sitting on it in the Justice Department, and yet they provided these evidence narratives that lied and said there was no evidence of sexual or physical abuse in the history of St. Anne's. I think the names of about 900 perpetrators of brutal crimes and tortures, sexual abuse of children were identified.
Survivors told adjudicators St. Anne's was one of the most brutal schools in the country, with a homemade electric chair. But their IAP claims were denied.
We had people who had been victimized, who had been told that their stories weren't credible, who were traumatized going back in those processes. Some attempted suicide. There was an incredible fallout from what they endured in those hearings.
Yet, despite the obstacles Canada keeps putting in their path, these survivors are still on their healing journey. If you could say anything you wanted to Prime Minister Trudeau, what would you say?
I would tell him, please, please look into this. We also have left home. We also endured a lot of the things that went on. And we need to be recognized. We need to be compensated.
The Pachinak Group invited now Indigenous Affairs Minister Carolyn Bennett to the site. And St. Anne survivors are fighting the government in court to get the documents they need. Angus says it shows how Canada is sorry, but not sorry.
From the beginning, there were concerns that the federal government, as the defendant, also having the oversight power and also having the responsibility to provide evidence, that there was a conflict of interest. When I see what's happened with St. Anne's and the deliberate obstruction of the rights of survivors, suppressing evidence, I can't believe that the federal government just had it in for the St. Anne survivors. So I have to assume that this is a pattern that's been repeated elsewhere.
Enter residential school lawyer David Patterson, trying to make sense of something called the administrative split. The IAP's reason to reject his client's claim after she was raped on school property.
She was denied compensation on the grounds that the classrooms in the residential school building were a day school, and therefore she was not entitled to compensation.
Another government tactic to avoid paying for survivors' pain? Patterson can't say.
I don't want my comments about the IAP to be misconstrued as saying I think the process was a bad one. I don't think it was. I think it was a good one. I think it was flawed. It could have been more broadly spirited. It could have dug deeper to try and see how do we use this enterprise as part of the process of effecting reconciliation.
In southwestern Ontario, former National Chief Del Riley avoided the IAP altogether.
I've spoken probably well over 100 people that have gone through the IAP, and all they have is nothing but complaints.
Riley says too much was bargained away in the settlement agreement. He's suing the government and the Anglican Church on his own for the abuse he says he suffered in residential school and the impact it had on his children.
The items that I'm suing for in the court document are way beyond what they would have allowed you in the IAP. Like they don't allow you to sue for loss of language, for loss of culture, breach of fiduciary. And a whole host of other things. There's a new term come up, and that's cultural genocide.
Riley says there should be compensation for intergenerational harms.
So I'm saying that, well, it's my legal advice as well from legal people that, yeah, fiduciary extends to my children too, as it should to all of the children across Canada who had parents that went to residential schools.
Ian Mosby says healing can't happen if things keep being covered up and then denied. The Toronto researcher exposed how nutritional experiments were performed on innocent children in some residential schools.
People could have believed what survivors were saying a long time ago, and I think we would be a lot further than we are right now.
I know that this is something that's important in our school and something we've talked about before. So today, I'd like you to give Mr. Kiewitz a very warm welcome. He is a survivor of residential school. He is not a victim. He's a survivor. And the difference is that he's not letting that stop him. He is trying to forgive and grow and move on. He's surviving this horrible thing that happened to him.
I was known as number 70. I was known as Andrew, my Christian name. The Roman Catholic baptized me Andrew Cuisance.
As the settlement agreement draws to a close, and Canadians wonder what comes next, Andrew Cuisance tells his story to another group of students.
And that when I was first come here, I was a savage. Excuse me for 1 minute. I shed a tear once in a while. I get emotional. I'm not ashamed of who I am anymore. I'm not ashamed to cry. I don't go there to point fingers. I don't go there to blame people. I go there to tell them the truth. And hopefully we can reconcile. You know, I gotta go back 50 years. Tell that boy
He's never done nothing wrong. He was a happy boy one time. People say we get those for nothing. I paid a big price for so little. For so little.
How old were you when you left?
15 going on 16. That's when my life just started to be ugly. Yep.
How old were you when you went there?
When I went to the residential school, 1958. I was born in 1954. My birthday is October 7th, 1954. And I entered residential school in 1958. Do your math. Just about 4 years old. It's the emotional pain they left in here that I gotta live with every day. I gotta cope with. I've gotta learn to live.
Yes, like so sometimes you've done it, like you
Yeah.
your stories and you cheer up.
It's okay.
Holy cow. Yeah, great questions. And you know, there are questions about you.
Thank you. Yeah.
It was around the time of the apology. This survivor walked into a small school division office in Yorkton, Saskatchewan, and said, "Use me."
It's the history of Canada that's never been told. It's been a hidden secret for years. Canada's hidden secret, and now it's been exposed. And now I go into schools and try and use it as a teaching tool, so the young people can understand and relate to one another. It's a healing process. You know, it keeps you in check. Where are you? What you doing? How are you doing it? It's positive. It helps in your healing. You learn to talk. You learn to deal with it. You learn to. At one time, I couldn't even talk about it, let alone talk about it now as today. I've learned. And in the end, who's going to benefit? The little ones I leave behind, the people I leave behind. That legacy of my life I want to leave. I tried to be a good parent. I tried to be a grandfather. I tried my best, the best way I knew how. Those are the things I try and instill in my family here.
And now I see Andrew coming and spreading the message to children. And he still brings some of that sadness and that fear and that anger and that hurt, but he has also shown forgiveness and growth. And as I mentioned to the kids, he's not a victim of residential schools. He is a survivor of residential schools and is moving forward and helping the rest of us learn how to be better people and how to make a better world.
A lot of people, I think, are aware of the work that I did as the chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission.
So what will be the legacy of the settlement agreement?
Never again will students be told that this is not an integral part of everything we are as a country.
I expect that in everything that I say, I will remind people of what it is that we heard, of some of the things that the survivors have reminded us and the elders who advised us have told us about, because those things don't easily leave you.
The TRC's 94 calls to action, the IAP compensation.
You know, there were tens of thousands of cases that went through this, and the vast majority of them resulted in compensation. The vast majority of them resulted in people who thought they were heard and had not been heard before, who were believed, who were respected, and who received compensation and apology.
The missing children, Peter Housty says, are buried on Alert Bay. The abusers we all know weren't prosecuted.
And sometimes we forget. I know I do. that there are people who are at the ground level that are truly hurting and that are in need of compensation and redress.
Or the survivors who slip between the cracks.
And I'm talking about survivors who are illiterate, that can't read and write, that don't understand the process. They're silenced. They're the voice, they're the weakened voice. And who really, truly represents them?
On the next APTN Investigates, reporter Rob Smith digs into the fate of the Kinder Morgan pipeline. Will Indigenous people stop it?
Kinder Morgan, they're not good.
There's no way we're going to let something happen to our lands and waters here.
Sooner die!
Markets in Asia for Alberta's heavy oil do not exist.
The company seems to think so.
Respecting Aboriginal rights may mean regulatory approval is denied.
But the bigger question remains, is it even needed?
The Government of Canada has approved.
Watch To Kill a Pipeline on APTN Investigates next week.